Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here and tell you about our summer's adventure. I can't help thinking that just a few days ago I got my first U of T faculty pension check, and I didn't realize it had anything to do with being windbound in the far north. But such is serendipity, I guess. By way of introduction, and with thanks to Hugh Stewart and Kathy Campbell, let me say that they were the, as Aleks pointed out, the catalysts and the driving force behind the idea for this trip and its organization. Each of us probably had our own individual reasons for signing on, but for me, the fact that in 2001, Terry and I and our son and daughter-in-law made a trip down the Wind River in the Peel, and that was some of the most beautiful country I've ever seen. The chance to get back there was hard to pass up. As well, there's a management land use plan for the Peel watershed. It's been under discussion and controversy for over 7 years that many of you may have heard about, and there are going to be changes in this region, and not all of them are going to be positive, but I'll say more about that later. So this was our route, 2 main watersheds, 6 rivers, access in by float plane from Mayo, and exit by scheduled air service from Old Crow. I should take a minute just to explain what the original itinerary was, as it informed a lot of discussions and our decisions over the next 2 months. Our original plan was for our friend Clayton White, who runs Cedar Canvas Adventures in Whitehorse, to descend the Eagle River, which you can see here where it crosses the Dempster Highway, by motorized freighter canoe and rendezvous with us in the abandoned Lapierre House. And from there, all of us would go down the Bell and Porcupine to Old Crow, and Clayton and I would fly out of there, and the rest we're going to continue down through Rampart House into Alaska and up by motorized freighter canoe to Dawson City up the Yukon. So just to put some perspective on all this, there's Whitehorse down at the bottom in the Yukon. This icon indicates Mayo, from where we flew into Duo Lakes, the headwaters of the Snake River, shown in pink, the Peel in green, Fort McPherson on the Dempster Highway. And this is the infamous Rat crossing the divide, and the Little Bell, and then in darker purple, the Porcupine and Old Crow in the top left-hand corner. So these are the members of our party, and a brief bio of each. Kathy Campbell, Hugh's partner, is a retired secondary school teacher living in Wakefield and a veteran of many northern trips. My friend Bob Davis from Halliburton has guided and traveled all over northern Canada by canoe and snowshoe for over 40 years. Yours truly with 2 months of beard. Anne-Marie Phillips is a canoe guide and dog musher in South River, Ontario, and an experienced canoe camp leader. Kate Prince is also a canoe camp leader and currently builds canoes with Hugh in Wakefield. And Hugh Stewart, who built the canoe that's in front of you, has led trips winter and summer for 50 years. He ran Headwaters as a canoe tripping business, as many of you know, and laterally as a canoe building business in Wakefield. Our outfit consisted of 2 18-foot Headwaters Prospector canoes and a 17-foot Chestnut. The flight in from Mayo was incredibly smooth, and I can tell you this as a veteran sufferer of air sickness. This is Duo Lakes. We had a Cessna bring in the 3rd canoe. And this is our camp at just under 4,000 feet of elevation. And it was just an incredible vista and an opportunity for hiking here. That almost looks like the same canoe that Hugh's leaning on. This pristine Egyptian cotton summer tent was lent to Bob and I by Craig McDonald, who I think is in the audience, and it served us well. Thank you very much, Craig, and sorry about all the mosquito carcasses. The first few days we spent hiking and plotting a route for the portage to the Snake River, and you can just make out our camp in the valley below. And there you can see our 3 tents again, and the Snake River Valley is to the north, up in that area. These black cliffs actually form the destination of the carry, which is not over a known trail, but that's roughly the put-in area. This mountain to the south of the camp, we made a hike up. We didn't summit it, obviously, but it was in our rearview mirror for about a week after we got started on the river. And that's looking down the Snake Valley again. And you can see the black cliffs over on the right-hand side of that slide in the Snake Valley. And there we are trying to climb without oxygen. Those are actually bear spray and canisters on our hips, not oxygen. The Duo Lakes actually are part of the Bonnet Plume watershed, and this is looking towards the Bonnet Plume Valley from high above camp, and a different view in the same direction, and Duo Lake in the foreground. And we did find snow on the hike. So this then is the route that we took down to the Snake River. You put in just above the braided section, and the footing's incredibly bad through here. It's about a mile, but only takes a couple hours or so. And that's our walk down. This is the put-in point, so you can see there's not a lot of water in the Snake at this point. The upper Snake is quite braided and swift, and sections are very rocky. With our wood canvas canoes and our rather conservative natures, this meant a lot of wading and lining, and what paddling we did was mostly back paddling and back ferrying. From what we had researched before the trip, this was a little bit unexpected, and we began to realize we were going to be falling behind our planned schedule at this point. Unfortunately, we all had quite a bit of flex in our schedules. There was lots of storms in the mountains and lots of rainbows, and again, you can see how shallow the braided section of the river is. Cold weather and rain provided a couple other days off for hiking as well. You can see here the braided part of the river from a high point. This is our camp at what we called the first canyon, just above Reptile Creek. We made a carry about 800 yards on the left there, and looking back up towards that camp. This is an albino porcupine. Bob and I observed this guy after the rest of the crew had gone to bed and were asleep. So you can imagine the reaction we got when we called into them and said, "Hey guys, come on out, there's an albino porcupine up the hill." Yeah, right. But we have the picture to prove it. So more pictures of the upper Snake. Beautiful striations of multicolored rock. Everywhere you look is a little different, but all striking and majestic. That's the mountain in the rearview mirror. And I can't tell you whether that's sunset or sunrise, but I'm out going to the bathroom, I guess. The snow melts pretty late out of the Snake Valley, and lots of it around in July yet. These mountains to the west of the Snake Valley are what's called the Bonnet Plume Range, and are the highest mountains in this part of the Rockies, and more reminiscent of the kind of ruggedness you see further south in the Rockies. We saw about 20 to 30 mountain sheep over the first 2 weeks, several moose, and bird life that we encountered were Baldwin golden eagles and peregrine falcons. This is the second canyon with particularly impressive views looking upstream to the south. And here there was a worn-in trail, but very steep, about 300 yards. And this was just before we made the descent back to the river. There's a rapid that's sometimes called exit rapids as you're getting near the end of the mountains, and fairly heavy water, which we carried around, but people do run it. And there's lots of rapids below the mountains for another day or so, but then things flattened out. There's some flora here. I'm no botanist. We reached the Peel River on July 18th. The lower Snake and the Peel have much less gradient, but still quite a swift current, and our progress increased from only 4 or 5 miles in the very upper part of the Snake to 40 or 50 miles here a day. Fort McPherson we arrived at on July 22nd. The Peel, as I mentioned, meets the Dempster Highway here, where there's a ferry, and Fort McPherson's about 11 kilometers down the Dempster. Fort McPherson, Old Crow, Aklavik, and the communities in the north in Alaska are all inhabited by the Gwich'in First Nations people, and these watersheds are their traditional homelands. Robert Aleks Sr. is an 80-year-old elder in Fort McPherson. He runs the visitor center in the territorial campground. He was a very engaging and informative contact for us about life on the land, and both present and past. 3 years ago, Robert was quoted as saying that an intact Peel watershed would be more valuable than any industrial development. To quote him, he said, "I say if we leave it alone, if it is protected, my young people will be wealthy for the rest of their lives." Now, we were about 6 days behind schedule at this point, and we hoped still to meet Clayton White at Lapierre House. And in order to make up a couple of days, we arranged with Peter Snowshoe, who had the largest riverboat in town, to take us down the Peel and up the Rat as far as the start of the steep going into the mountains, a distance of approximately 55 miles. Peter's expertise in towing our canoes through the maze of the lower Rat in the southern Delta area was quite impressive. So here you can see a map of just that section. Fort McPherson's down on the bottom right here, the Peel River, what's called Husky Channel of the Peel. The Rat leaves that and goes through this Delta section, and then this abrupt change here is the foothills of the Richardson Mountains, where he dropped us off. And he dropped us off at the site of what's called Destruction City. In 1898, one of the least successful routes to Dawson City was down the Mackenzie, up the Peel, and up the Rat River and over McDougall Pass to the Yukon drainage, actually exactly where we were going. Many of those who chose this route found they could not take their heavy boats up the steep portion of the Rat River. The elevation gain is over 1,000 feet in about 35 miles. And so the name Destruction City, as some of you may know, arose from the fact that here they chopped down their boats to more manageable size, and many of them had to overwinter here to await breakup. Of the 50 to 100 who wintered here, several died of scurvy, and only a handful made it to Dawson late the next summer. However, the route is tempting for one simple fact. It's the lowest pass by far in the Canadian Rockies, at just over 1,000 feet, and the portage between the watersheds via Summit Lake is less than a mile. But as Eric Morse wrote years ago, just give up any hope of actually doing any paddling. So early days on the Rat confirmed our apprehension about progress. Almost no paddling, wading, lining, ferrying across the river to access inside bends and workable gravel beaches. As well, the Rat was fairly high, and there was a lot of debris in the river, and sometimes brush had to be cut in order to wade in shallow enough water. We were prepared to get up to our waists, but it was pretty cold if you got much higher than that. Occasionally, the gradient was so steep that we had to put 4 people on a canoe. So as you can imagine, our progress was fairly slow, 3 to 4 days in linear travel. It was more encouraging to measure our progress vertically. So a good day was 100 feet gained in elevation. On July 29th, we stopped early in the afternoon to take a half a day of rest from those sort of labors, and it proved to be a lucky decision as we were camped at least 8 feet above the water as the weather gods turned against us. Heavy rain began at 6 p.m. and continued until midnight. In this country, rain in the mountains with limited absorption due to the permafrost means that the rivers can rise vertically in a hurry. So you can see on the far side of this slide, the shoal that's clearly above water, and then the next morning, clearly underwater. So the river had come up about 4 vertical feet. Fortunately, our canoes were secure, but we did actually lose 3 paddles, and we felt fortunate it wasn't worse. So with the river in flood, progress was now impossible, and then a second rain on the 31st of July, and we were halted for 4 nights. So we occupied ourselves making smudge pots, patent pending, carving canoe poles, playing cards for spending money in Dawson, reading, crocheting, and botanizing. Fake apple I recognize in dogwood, at least. By August the 2nd, the river had dropped back to about a foot above the pre-rain level, so we decided to proceed. It was still slow progress, and 3 days later we made the decision that our rendezvous with Clayton White would not happen, as we'd be too late for him to meet his commitments. So Clayton was kind enough to arrange our next food drop to be shipped to Inuvik and flown into Summit Lake and McDougall Pass. The next day after that, we reached the so-called Canyon of the Rat, which was really not more difficult than the previous travel, but the river valley is becoming more sharply incised. Ferrying across the river from below these cliffs that were crumbling was actually some of the most harrowing part of the whole summer, since you always had the feeling that something was going to fall right on you. Above the canyon, the river gradient began to decrease, and our progress, both vertically and in a linear way, improved. We're still, or at least we're not up to our waists. And sometimes we were actually even paddling forward, as we were in this picture. So a hike one evening around midnight provided a much more benign look at the Rat River. The melting of permafrost in this part of the north, as you probably know, is an increasing problem. You can see a mudslide here, and you can see permafrost slumping in the bottom right-hand corner beside this campsite that we had. We began to see more and more of the Richardson Mountains, which was encouraging that we were making some progress, as well as a nice diversion. And here we are getting closer and closer to McDougall Pass. Wading and dragging canoes is hard on wood canvas canoes, and Hugh Stewart and I are putting on some ambroid patches one evening. We began to see more caribou and more evidence of small herds crossing the Rat River. Fortunately, this grizzly was a long ways away on the other side of the river, and we had no encounters anywhere near as scary as Rob indicated. Just before, as you're approaching McDougall Pass, where Sheep and Fish Creek come in, there's a final difficult pull up this bit of water, and then suddenly you're in headwaters country, pretty much like the Burnt River in Halliburton, actually. So you can see at camp here, we're all feeling a lot happier about this. And the mountains, the Richardson Mountains, are really quite lovely. Twin Lakes marks the finish of the uphill climb, well, except for the odd beaver dam. So this is the route this is Twin Lakes here, and you can paddle right into Ogilvie Lake. There's a short carry into this unnamed lake here, and then about 700 yards into Summit Lake, crossing the border between the NWT and Yukon. As before, the footing was terrible. All these sort of hummocks and tussocks that you sort of stumble over, particularly when carrying the canoes. And a round of Yukon Jack liqueur at Summit Lake. We spent 3 or 4 days in Summit Lake hiking, relaxing, and waiting for the food drop to come in. You can see our camp in the valley below. And those are the lakes that we portage through, and Summit Lake here on the right. And Anne looking at the next leg of the journey towards the Little Bell Valley. The weather really turned on us. We had really lovely, sunny, warm weather coming up the Rat and for the first few days here, but then fall just suddenly occurred around August 14th. And the Cessna just kind of got in under this ceiling and got out again. But I was happier to be on ground than up there. And there we are repacking for the next and final leg of the trip. So on August 15th, we carried out of Summit Lake. There's a little creek there, and you can access the Little Bell River, which is a small twisty stream, and then the Bell River on the left of that slide. And you can see some of the foliage starting to turn here. The Little Bell is a clear-flowing, shallow, but lovely change from the Rat River. And the mountain scenery in the Richardsons is really quite lovely, and it was a fact that we hadn't read about in previous journals. With the advent of fall, Bob Davis and I set up a small cold weather tent and stove, which we had shipped into Fort McPherson. This became a popular visiting spot for the other 4 and a useful drying center. The Bell River, as I mentioned, is bigger and deeper, but still quite a bit of gradient, and you can make pretty good progress. We saw more and more caribou, which we felt were probably part of the Porcupine River herd on their late summer and fall migration from their calving grounds in North Alaska. And this is just part of one of those small herds. Lapierre House, not much left. We thought that these probably dated from the early 20th century when it was primarily a private trading post. In the late 19th century, it was a Hudson Bay post accessed over land, of all things, from Fort McPherson to be a link to the Yukon drainage and the First Nations people in that area and in the Porcupine River. But because of the difficult access and issues around national borders in Alaska, it was never very successful. These 3 bull caribou were at where the Eagle River comes into the Bell. The Porcupine River, the last 4 days in this broad river valley were mainly cold and drizzly, and we even got a bit of wet snow. And you can see we're well dressed. But the sun did shine occasionally, and there was a sundog one evening. And the lichen's starting to turn, so canoeing season is ending soon. And there's some snow in the hills. As we got closer to Old Crow, we began to see more and more camps of the people coming up for the salmon run and the fall caribou hunt. And one of the elders even donated our supper to us one evening. Old Crow Village is the most northern village in the Yukon and not accessible by road. We got here on August 25th. The people here were especially friendly, welcoming, and generous. Within hours of setting up camp, we had smoked whitefish, fresh and frozen caribou, and some bannock right out of the oven brought to us for supper. Peter Josie here is sharing the caribou stew with us, brought us fresh water every day and a thermos of coffee, which we were all except Bob Davis, anxious for. The people still depend heavily on the land, and most of their protein still comes from caribou and fish. And they were very interested in where we had seen caribou and how many, and as they were just getting underway with their fall hunt. They take their stewardship of the herd very seriously. And this is just some fresh caribou drying in one of the elders' homes. Stephen Frost, pictured on the left here, is one of the elders in town, and Hugh decided to leave his 18-foot canoe with the community and trusting it to Stephen. He's 82 now and was a very kind and gentleman and eloquent spokesman for his people. And he had spent most of his life on the land. Of course, all good trips come to an end. Peter brought us one last thermos of coffee and was kind enough to take all our heavy gear down to the airport for us. This is one of our few group pictures on the Upper Snake. I'll just mention what a fantastic 8 weeks it was, traveling with close friends who were very capable people. Beautiful country, lots of challenges and adventure. In our contact with the First Nations people was generous, inspiring, and particularly in the village of Old Crow, a wonderful way to end the trip. I said I'd make some note about the Peel River watershed plan. The Yukon government, as you may know, 3 weeks ago released their final plan, and it unfortunately only protects about 29% of the watershed. The original Planning Commission had recommended protection of 80% of the watershed. That report, as I mentioned, took 7 years and itself was a compromise, but one that all 4 of the First Nations groups supported. And obviously they feel betrayed and worried for their future and the future of the Porcupine Caribou River caribou. So I'm going to sort of give the last word to Stephen Frost. Not too long ago, he was quoted as saying, "That poor Porcupine River caribou herd, it don't mean a darn thing to people in the South, and I guess it shouldn't. It's not their style of life, but to us it means lots. I guess we depend on it like a lot of people depend on farming." So I hope you'll agree that this land and these people and the Porcupine caribou herd should mean a lot to all of us as well. Thank you very much.